some time I've been posting about my concerns in relation to democracy, the kind of way we see ourselves, how politics has been developing, and whether or not we're at a period whereby we need to start to consider whether our democracies are failing, whether it be right or whether it be left, are taking over, and whether or not people, voters, community, citizens, whatever, are suffering as a result of simply being neglected. Now, we know that for years, lower class people, the poverty people, homeless people, people on welfare, they had been neglected for years and still are to a large extent. We also know that the middle class had been neglected for decades, and while the middle class shrunk, so did the lower class, and the wealthy just became wealthier. That particular group didn't increase terribly much at all. They just gathered more and more wealth. So there has been some shifts, I guess, in society over the years, and occasionally when we get the lower groups of people, when we get a lot of them feeling dissatisfied, they will tend to rebel, and sometimes a revolution may happen as a result of that, or changes of government, or they're forced to change the way politicians view their ideology and perhaps change their ideology to best fit with that group that's going to determine whether they get elected or not. Here in Australia, I guess, because we have what we call compulsory voting. It isn't compulsory voting because you don't have to vote if you're not registered, but most people do register, and once you register, you're compelled to vote. And it's a cultural thing whereby we feel kind of obligated to do that. Most people do it, and most people do tend to, 80%, I guess, do tend to vote. So, but one of the issues that has come out of all of this, I think, has been the changing in democracy over time. And what we're noticing around the world is that there have become more authoritarian leaders, that they are shifting more and more to the right of politics, and that they are less and less interested in what the majority particularly would like. They are self-serving, narcissistic, and in some cases psychopathic. So, but there was an interesting article in the Crikey, which I just wanted to read some of it to you, because they raise some really great points. They start off this article by talking about Trump, and I think Trump's a good place to start anyway. And it's not like he's the first authoritarian type leader, but he won't be the last, but he's obviously the most current and the most powerful nation on this planet. So I guess he is important. And they do mention in this article other people too that they note that are in power at the moment who are authoritarian, even though they might be in democratic societies. Right, so the article says there is clear evidence that the Trump administration planned a coup last January, and large sections of the Republican Party continue to peddle the lie that Trump was robbed of victory. Across numerous states, Republican governments are putting in place laws to ensure that the mistake of November 2020 doesn't happen again in 2024. Similarly, in India, a right-wing populist has imposed an increasingly fascist government on what was once the world's largest democracy. Now, they highlight 6 points that they say are important to understand. And as we think about this, I think we need to think about, do these points relate to us? Can we see any correlation between what happens in our society here in Australia and what happens elsewhere? And do we need to be worried if we tick some of these boxes? So we'll go through them and just tell me what you think. Is the will of the electorate being reflected in parliamentary representation? And they discuss some of these in a moment, and we'll talk about them. Is there a good balance between the power of the state and the rights of citizens? How healthy are key democratic institutions like integrity bodies, such as independent regulators, an independent media, and an independent judiciary? Do powerful or wealthy interests interfere with decision making or have access to decision makers beyond that of ordinary citizens? In a colonial settler society, such as ours in the United States, is there recognition of and treaty with First People? Is anti-democratic sentiment and political extremism growing? So I guess we'll try and tackle each one of those at a time. So, is the will of the electorate being reflected in parliamentary representations? Well, it isn't. There are far more men in positions of political power and authority than there are women. And further on, are there fair representation of Indigenous people in each country? Place like India, I guess you can argue, yes, there are. But in a place, but the Indigenous people, those countries that have been colonised in particular, even though India has been, but places like the US and here, is there a fair representation of Indigenous people? And no, there isn't. And I'll just talk about Australia because I don't know all that much about Victoria. Don't know all that much about the United States. But here in Australia, there is an increasing number, all on Labor side, on the left of politics, but very little, if any, on the right side of politics. Is there a good balance between the power of the state and the rights of citizens? We don't have a Bill of Rights here in Australia, and it's probably a good thing. It would be a good thing if we did have one, but we don't. So our Constitution tends to stand up in most cases, and the High Court generally does support rights. But in terms of human rights, though, how do we fare? We fare pretty poorly in terms of what the Human Rights, United Nations human rights would say, whatever they're called, and because of the way we treat particularly Indigenous people. So we don't do too well on human rights. But are our rights generally represented across the nation, apart from COVID and the problems that's caused? Yeah, generally I think our rights are pretty much represented. How healthy are key democratic institutions like integrity bodies, independent regulators, independent media and independent judiciary? Now some of these things the article does discuss later on, and particularly in relation to ICAC, the government suggesting that they want a federal ICAC investigating them for any wrongdoings that happen within Parliament, with parliamentarians do. But at the end of the day, Morrison's chosen not to go down that path, probably because he finds that he'd be in a heap of hot water if he had, as is the case with Gladys Berejiklian. Do powerful or wealthy interests interfere with decision making or have access to decision makers beyond that of ordinary citizens? Yes, they do. There are lobby groups, you still have to register as a lobbyist, but they spend millions of dollars lobbying for self-interest, I think. I heard Bernie Sanders say that in the US, the amount of money, which is hundreds of millions of dollars, is being spent by the coal and the fossil fuel industries so that they can get their way and that they're not going to lose their businesses. Of course they do. They do. In a colonial settled society, is there recognition of a treaty with First Nations? There is in New Zealand, and there are some, I think it may be in the US and Canada, I don't know, but there certainly aren't any here in Australia, as there should be. Is anti-democratic sentiment and political extremism growing? Well, I think that it is. We're moving further, we're becoming more and more polarised, further to the right, further to the left, and I think that that is one of the issues which we need to find a way to deal with. And so in the article they go on to say that there is an area where representation is under threat. The Morrison government's attempt to legislate to address entirely confected claims of problems with voter ID. The importation of a racist tactic from Republicans in the United States designed to disenfranchise African American voters. So here they're conflating the two issues around the way the Americans are working towards disenfranchising African Americans, make it more difficult for those people who are on benefits or low incomes, make it more difficult for them to vote. And here in Australia, through the ID card, I think the argument is that that's exactly the same that will happen here. But I'm not too sure how I feel about ID card. I mean, for me, it's not a problem, but there are many people who probably won't make the effort to go and get an ID card to vote. It's just one extra thing that a person has to do in order to be able to vote. So I think it would be difficult to bring. A lot of people disagree here in Australia with the fact that we don't have voluntary voting, that it is compulsory. So a lot of people would object if they had to have an ID card, and whether there'd be a penalty if you didn't get an ID card to vote. I don't know how they'd implement all of that, but that's what they're thinking. Okay, on this page here, so they're talking about key democratic institutions. So key democratic institutions in Australia are under attack at all levels. Scott Morrison has attacked the New South Wales Independent Commission against Corruption. Freedom of information laws are flouted at the Commonwealth and state levels. And there's certainly less transparency, as you see I've written on this page. You see less transparency in these areas as well. Goes on to say, fossil fuel executives have written the Morrison government energy policy, so we know that definitely happens. I'll just better put this back on. So we know that definitely happens. Fossil fuel executives have written the Morrison government energy policy. Indigenous recognition continues to be delayed. We've been working on that particular problem for ages, and that doesn't seem to get any uptake. Appropriate representation in Parliament. One of the concepts that I like, which is a New Zealand concept, whereby they have I don't know how many seats it is, 5 seats maybe, and they're dedicated just to Maori people. And we could do the same by having Aboriginal people in Australia vote collectively, I guess, for a certain number of representations from each state. So that would be 6. So that's definitely a possibility as well, and I think needs to be considered. Major party politicians urging civil disobedience and promoting anti-vaccine material. This is where the extremism. So it's this one here. Extremism is increasing significantly, and we see that now. There is this distinct split, this divergence happening around extremism, and we saw some during the last election where the right wing decided that they wanted to be extremely racist, which is not unusual for them, but it was interesting to see that they were advocating for that in terms of rallies and stuff, and all these patriotic groups come out that are anti-Semitic and so on. So we know that there's more of that happening, and that is particularly a concern to all of us. So as you can see, I think the point is that there is much that's happening in our society that would make us wonder about whether or not our democracies are safe, whether they are intact, whether they're going to stay the same, or whether they are likely to be slowly whittled away until we build a society which is far more autocratic, and that we look to that one godly leader to govern us, or because for some reason they have our interests at heart. It is rare that an autocratic leader has the interest of the populace at heart. They're always usually in it for themselves, so they can't be trusted. But for some reason, there are a lot of weak people, I think, who believe that they can look to somebody else to give them what they need rather than fighting for it for themselves. Thanks everybody for being with me. Take care, look after yourselves, and be safe, and have a happy season.